When I read this case, I have to admit I was a little bit shocked at how much it got me thinking about things I normally don't think about. It was Saturday, May 28, 1972. The spring grizzly bear season in Unit 20 of Central Alaska was closing in 3 days. Lee McNeil and his friend Paul Miller managed to book a couple days off from work to go hunting. They left home at 5 o'clock determined to get an early start. McNeil noted that there was a cold wind blowing from the southeast, but most of the winter snow was gone, save for a few thick clumps here and there. The two men half waded, half paddled a small boat across the Big Delta River early in the morning, getting themselves soaking wet in the process. They eventually arrived at their spot. It was now near noon and they found themselves on top of a small foothill below McGinnis Peak, overlooking a tundra-covered valley that had been drained by Sager Creek. They stopped to scan the valley. Paul suddenly pointed to the southeast. He had spotted something. Lee peered through his binoculars and picked up the hulk of a large grizzly bear which had apparently been traveling north along the western bank of the Big Delta River. They studied the animal for a period of time and determined that the way it was traveling along the base of their small foothill, it would eventually come to within a few yards of their position. And given that the day was half gone, they had had almost nothing to eat, and they were both tired from hiking and boating, they ultimately decided to stay where they were. They thought it best to use the time to eat their lunch whilst keeping an eye on the bear. They reasoned that it would eventually come within shooting distance of them, so what would it serve them to move? The two friends found a small depression covered over with small thick bushes and settled down, out of the wind, to wait. The late May sun was bright and warm in that spot, so they sprawled out on the moss-covered ground and soaked up the warmth. The wild strawberries were just ripening, and they had picked some along the way. While keeping track of the bear's progress, they munched their food and whisper-chatted with each other and waited for the animal to get closer. Several hours passed. The bear was now about 500 yards from the two hunters, moving in an unhurried manner, seemingly sniffing and investigating everything it came across. He would stop to dig here, turn over a rock there, but his path would take him less than 100 yards below us in the valley, unless he made a drastic change. We now became aware of a small herd of caribou, perhaps 76 animals, located to our left in the valley, and feeding their way towards our position and towards the bear. As the wind was blowing into our faces from the southeast, the bear was approaching from the southeast and the caribou from the northeast. We realized that the animals would not get wind of us, nor of each other, and would be totally unaware of any presence until they actually sighted one another. We were now fervently hoping the bear would move within range of our rifles before the caribou arrived. But at present he was digging into a mound of dirt that had drawn his attention. An anxious hour passed, and the caribou had moved to within 600 yards of Lee and Paul's position. The bear had left the mound of dirt and was moving, faster than before, directly towards the caribou. We were debating whether the bear was aware of the caribou or not, when he raised to his hind legs, sniffed the air on his haunches, dropped on all fours again, and actually seemed to try to flatten himself closer to the ground in a half crouch as he moved towards the herd. The caribou herd was now due southeast of our position at about 400 yards, and the bear came moving out of a small draw directly below us at about 100 yards. The caribou were now directly upwind of the bear, and he was intent on stalking them. Nothing else seemed to matter to him. Lee noted that they had studied the herd and determined they were quite young. Their horns were only starting to grow. We'd flipped a coin to see who would get the first bear, and Paul had won. It was determined that Paul would be the one to take out the bear. Lee would only shoot if Paul's third shot did not fall the animal, or if it turned to attack them. Otherwise, he would only wait and watch. We were so intent on watching the bear and the caribou that we did not notice the cloud bank spilling over the top of Mount Hayes, which quickly covered most of the sky. The sun was now slanting in from the far west, but the bear was in a perfect spot and had no idea we were there. We were now in prone shooting positions looking through our rifle scopes at the huge bruin. We could also see the caribou in the background as our elevated position gave us a perfect view. Now was the time. Paul asked Lee to count to 3 slowly and he would commence shooting on 3. As he began counting, Lee claims that he suddenly heard a, quote, whirring, rustling noise. He stopped the count and asked Paul what the sound was, where it was coming from. Paul shrugged it off, commenting that it was the wind and it was picking up. He was so focused on the bear that he didn't seem to much care either way. I began my count again. As we watched through our scopes, the area seemed to get a little brighter, but I continued slowly. 1, 2. Now I saw a blue ball of fire drop straight from above, strike the ground among the caribou, and split into smaller balls of blue fire, each fragment as quick as a bolt of lightning, speeding straight to a caribou. All of the caribou visible to me through my rifle scope fell to the ground as if struck in the head with an invisible sledgehammer. I quickly looked at Paul and could tell by the expression on his face that he had observed the same thing. Within seconds, Lee and Paul found themselves in the presence of something truly mysterious. "What the hell was that?" I heard him whisper. We jumped to our feet and instantly became aware of a giant sphere-shaped object hovering directly above us. Not knowing the size of the sphere, it would be impossible to say how high it was, but it gave the impression of being very big and very low, perhaps 500 yards or less off the ground. Lee described that its underbelly was a dull orange, the color of a red-hot piece of iron. It seemed to be pulsating slowly from dark to lighter, and back again. As we watched dumbfounded, we saw an intense beam of white light flash down from the sphere. 1 flash, 2, 3, and more. As we watched, we became aware that each time the light flashed, another caribou disappeared. One cow and its calf, which had fallen nearest to us in plain sight, both completely disappeared when the beam hit them. I do not know what kind of thoughts Paul may have had at this time, but a sudden fear gripped me, and I dropped back to the ground in the depression among the bushes. Paul must have had the same feeling, as he too immediately dropped back into the bushes. The sphere was still in full view above us, and we realized we were no safer in the bushes than we had been while standing in the open. That is when Paul did something that surprised Lee. "They are going to get us," he shouted to Lee. He further indicated that they needed to protect themselves. He raised his 7mm Magnum, sighted on the sphere, and fired. The roar of the powerful rifle had hardly died when I heard his 170-grain bullet whack into the bottom of the object. It did not clunk, as I expected from a bullet impacting on metal, but rather it was the sound a cartridge makes when it strikes a solid block of concrete. Paul fired again, and again Lee heard the same distinct whack sound reverberate down the valley. And that was the last thing he remembered. As Lee sat watching Paul fire on the object, he claims that a, quote, light exploded inside my head. That was the best way he could describe it. The next thing I remember was being very cold and Paul shaking me awake. It was getting dark, which means about 10:30 p.m. in central Alaska in late May. The sun had apparently just set in the northwest, but there was still plenty of light to see by. We stood up and looked around. The forgotten bear was nowhere in sight. We could still see many caribou lying on the valley floor where they had fallen, and we cautiously worked our way down to them. Paul and Lee counted 48 caribou lying dead in an area not much larger than 50 yards square. From what they could determine, the animals showed no sign of injury. The two men did take notice of a small trench cut into the ground, which seemed to lead from each deceased animal to a circular hole near the center of where the herd had stood. This seemed to correspond with the object that they had seen come down into the middle of the herd, and the path of the smaller lights that emerged from it. We may have missed a few deceased animals, as we could not give the task our undivided attention. There was a very large grizzly bear somewhere nearby, and a large sphere that was still fresh in our minds. We climbed back to the top of the hill, and after discussing our situation at length, decided to camp on the spot until first light, and then trudge back to the east side of the Big Delta River. At the time, both Lee and Paul were employed at Fort Greely, and both were working on a sensitive nuclear project. They determined that it would probably be in their best interest to keep their mouths shut on what they had just observed. We made a vow to one another that we would say nothing of what we had seen for the time being, and we kept our word. When the caribou were eventually discovered, the U.S. Army was the first to be blamed, as the carcasses were discovered on the military reservation of Fort Greely. The Army initially claimed that they believed that some kind of nerve agent had been used, but later changed it to an exotic artillery shell. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game next got involved, issuing a statement that they determined that an extraordinary large bolt of lightning was to blame. Eventually, the project was shut down, and Paul and Lee were no longer employed at Fort Greely. In 1981, nearly a decade later, Lee sat down and wrote of that day in 1972. He would eventually send his report to the leading UFO magazine at the time. Remember, this was before the internet. Harry Belisle's UFO Update, which was based out of New York. In wrapping up his summary, Lee noted that he had become quite concerned about the declining number of animals in Alaska and elsewhere. He found it odd that nobody was discussing it. The Brooks Range caribou herd dropped from 200,000 animals in 1972 to less than 75,000 when the count was remade in 1976. What happened to those 125,000 animals? The Christo China caribou herd in central Alaska dropped from 20,000 animals to 5,000. The Nell China herd dropped from 20,000 down to approximately 5,000. The 40-mile herd in northeastern Alaska had dropped from 40,000 animals to 8,000 in just 3 years. The Delta herd, the one I watched, lost half its number in a few years. The Maycomb Plateau herd lost half of its animals. The moose, once so abundant in central Alaska. 20 or more moose could be counted any day on an 80-mile drive from Delta Junction to Paxton, are now very scarce. Today, this drive can be made over and over without seeing a single moose. The buffalo herd in Wood Buffalo National Park, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories dropped from 12,000 to 5,528 animals between 1970 and 1975, with no logical explanation as to where the animals went. The buffalo herd north of the park dropped from 2,500 animals to 1,250 during the same period. More than 7,000 buffalo are unaccounted for. Ranchers in the western states have reported many of their livestock deceased and many, many more missing. Lee wondered if what he saw that day in the valley in 1972 might be part of the reason for such a massive decline. Are beings coming here from someplace else and taking our animals? I remember reading about the Norway case with the 300 reindeer being taken out with a single lightning strike, and I remember thinking how strange it was, but I never really realized until this case how common this is, where multiple animals, 50, 100, 200, 300 animals will be taken out with a single lightning strike. So I just found that a little odd. And when I started looking into it, I was just shocked by how many of these types of cases are out there. And I don't know, it just seems a little bit weird to me.